This week I have a story for you about some people who grow up in a cult. The story deals with the way outside forces impinge upon the activities of the cult. Outside forces in the form of massive sabre-toothed cats. Maybe it's all an allegory, or then again maybe it is just a story about massive cats eating people. I'm not even sure myself. There are those who claim the Dinophilis, a kind of sabre-toothed cat, specifically preyed on human beings, or rather on our pre-human ancestors. The creature became extinct 1.2 million years ago and was a contemporary of the proto-hominid Australopithecus africanus. It possessed two great fangs and a mouth large enough to encompass a human head. Australopithecus skulls have been found with holes in them seemingly made by Dinophilis fangs. If it really preyed mainly on hominids, it would have been the closest thing that has ever existed to an apex predator specializing in eating human beings. Only a deranged psychopath would want to bring back such a monster to the modern era. But I'm already getting ahead of myself. I need to start this story at the beginning. I was raised in a kind of cult known as the Organisation. Many have since told me that the Organisation doesn't really fit the definition of a cult, since there was no single charismatic leader, but if you too had grown up in it, you wouldn't worry too much about maligning them with pejorative labels. The Organisation eschewed all modern technology, although, hypocrites that they were, few members really managed to do completely without any form of technology at all. You have to understand what their hatred of technology really means. From time to time, people died of preventable diseases, and even a small cut could turn into something life-threatening. Sometimes women died in childbirth, although most were not above utilising the services of a doctor if they got into a real fix. Unfortunately, my mother was among those who stuck firmly to her principles and consequently died 3 hours after I was born. I dare say my father tried his best to raise me, but a significant fraction of his time was spent brewing and consuming various revolting beers, and I rarely saw him sober. He was an angry, bitter man, prone to violent outbursts. When he died, a cursory funeral was held for him, but the reality was that he was missed by no one, not even me. I don't doubt that my father's bitterness was heightened by the fact that we quite often encountered the people we knew as the others, which is to say, the entire rest of the planet. And he could very well see that the others were living far easier and more pleasant lives than ourselves. Still, he could not bring himself to leave the Organisation, and for that, I cannot blame him. Leaving meant no one you knew would ever speak to you again. I could go on for a while telling you about the many lies and the terrible hypocrisy of that dreadful, silly cult, but there's little point. Nearly all of them are now dead. When I was 12 years old, I was apprenticed to an archer named Joe. Strictly speaking, a maker of bows is known as a bowyer, and a maker of arrows is a fletcher. But Joe made both, and we knew him as Joe the Archer, or Joe Archer. Joe was born into the Organisation, just like myself, and he was a good man, well liked by everyone, if naive. Don't you ever think of leaving the Organisation, I used to say to him from time to time. I'm too old to do that, he used to reply. But that's exactly why you should leave, I'd say, and he'd wave me away with a smile. The Organisation had been founded by people who believed with an iron certainty that society was on a doomed trajectory and would eventually collapse. Only the Organisation and those who adhered to its principles would survive. I don't think Joe really believed that, but he kept his thoughts to himself and concentrated on making bows and arrows, By the time my father died, I had become very close to my childhood friend Karina, and everyone expected that when we reached 20 years old, we would marry, as was the custom in the cult. Instead, we disappointed everyone. Neither of us could see a future for any children we might spawn in the organisation. Yet neither of us were quite brave enough to leave. We used to talk about leaving. But you know, when you're brought up around a set of people who all have certain beliefs, it's very hard to free your mind from the hold those beliefs have over you, no matter how deluded those beliefs may appear to others. It was around that time that Karina happened to meet Peter. At first I was a little jealous, but I soon realised her feelings for Peter were entirely platonic, and it wasn't long before I myself began to consider Peter a friend. The circumstances of their meeting were quite unusual. You see, Peter was an outsider, one of the others. His bike had broken down at the edge of the forest, and he had encountered Karina gathering raspberries. Perhaps she sensed that Peter could be our way out of the organisation, and although he was soon picked up and taken back to civilization, he returned a week later to visit her. The three of us spent many evenings sitting secretly around a campfire, toasting arrowroots on sticks. The only person we let in on our secret meetings was Joe, and he was always guarded in what he said. "I could arrange accommodation for all of you," Peter said once. "What are your friends here really worth if they'll cut you off if you leave? To me, those aren't even real friends." "They're just scared," said Karina. "But what of?" said Peter. "Of each other," she said. "No one wants to risk being shunned, so they all fall into line." "Then leave," said Peter. Karina and I exchanged nervous glances. "It's not so easy as you think," said Joe, laughing quietly to himself and poking the fire with a stick. And that's how things went on for 2 more years. Whether we would ever have left or not, I don't know. I think we would. I think we were getting close to leaving. We just needed a few years to get up the nerve. We knew very little of the world of the others. Leaving would certainly not have been easy. The closest thing I can compare it to is if you imagine being a member of the Amish and leaving that. But the Amish even encouraged their sons and daughters to experience the outside world, and not even they shunned technology as completely as we did. One evening, the 4 of us stayed up late far into the night, talking around a fire on the edge of the forest, and we all decided to sleep out there under the stars. The night was warm, and Joe had already fallen asleep by the time Karina and Peter and I decided we might as well join him. When the sun came up, Peter got on his bike and shot off over the open fields, and Karina and Joe and I trudged back to the village. When we arrived at the village, we saw immediately that something was wrong. A woman was crying loudly somewhere, and people were standing around discussing something in hushed voices. "What's going on?" said Joe. Elias replied. "It's Agatha," he said. "She's been attacked. She's dead." "Who by?" said Joe, visibly paling. Such things were quite unheard of in our community. "Not by a person," said Elias. "A beast. Some kind of huge fanged cat, they say. They fired after it, but it got away. Shame you weren't here. Maybe you could have got it." Agatha was only 20 years old. They showed us her remains. There were 2 huge holes in the back of her head, and a bloody line where sharp feline teeth had gripped her forehead. Her mother was crying hysterically. 5 people had seen the animal, and they described it as a huge fanged cat with teeth the size of sabres, a description which defied credulity, since the only cats we had ever seen were of the domestic variety. It was Arno the Potter who gave voice to people's thoughts, his voice rising above the confused chatter. "This is the work of the governor," he said. "The governor is misguided, not evil," said Joe. "That's a matter of opinion," said Arno. "This argues otherwise." He nodded towards Agatha's corpse. At first it was hard to believe that this could truly be the governor's work. It was an article of faith in the organisation, that Governor Caravaggio was a fool, but few of us truly believed him evil. Had he not created the very forests and rivers upon which we depended? The governor left us alone and allowed us to go our own way, and none of us had ever truly heard a single bad thing about him. We held a funeral for Agatha the very next day, as was the custom. Even after the week of mourning had passed, things were not the same in the organisation. Everyone was on edge, nervously watching their backs in case the beast pounced on them. Many said an animal like that would most likely attack from behind, although it appeared to have seized Agatha's head from the front. Some boasted they would slice the beast open soon as look at it, but even they could not hide their fear. Karina and I were very anxious to discuss the matter with Peter, but we had no way of contacting him. We met him only on the edge of the forest in the evening when the moon was full. We had to wait a month before we could contact him again. There were no more attacks that month, and people had begun to relax by the time the full moon came round again. He arrived as usual by bike, and he brought strange news of his own. As soon as he got off his bike, we told him about the strange creature that had killed Agatha. "It must be some kind of mistake," he said doubtfully. "Even the governor makes mistakes. He's a human being like us." "He's never made a mistake before," said Karina. "Why now?" "I don't know, but something's going on," said Peter. "Something very bad. You know, I've told you before about Emil." "The old man with the big mouth," said Karina. "Yes, him. Some people came to his house and took him away. We don't know where he is." "What do you mean, took him away?" said Karina. "Exactly that," said Peter. "They were wearing strange clothes, all identical. Dorita saw the whole thing. They said they were from the governor and they took him somewhere. We can't find out where." "What if the governor has lost his mind?" I said. "Sometimes it happens in the organisation when people refuse to see doctors. They randomly go crazy." "What do you mean, like eccentric?" said Peter. "No," I said, "not eccentricity. I mean an illness of the brain." "That can't happen to the governor," said Peter. "It only happens with your lot because they don't get proper medical attention." We spent many hours discussing the attack and the disappearance of Emil, but we could come to no conclusion. Nothing like these things had ever happened before, and even most of the people in the organisation had a certain regard for the governor, including ourselves, and we couldn't imagine him capable of malice, nor of madness. The week after that, our friend Arcto disappeared. Someone found some blood and hair adhering to a tree trunk, and that was the only trace anyone ever found of him. He was the first of many. 2 days later, Zola was attacked and eaten by a fanged cat. Then came the worst attack of all. An entire family was attacked by 2 beasts in the middle of the night and consumed. The area was left strewn with detached arms and chunks of flesh. The entire community was terrified. We began to go around in 2s and 3s, and everyone set to work attempting to fortify their houses against the creatures with fences and spikes. Joe and I set to work attempting to make bows that might be capable of killing the creatures, but our attempts were clumsy, and the resulting bows were often so heavy and brittle that we judged them of little use. We did our best nonetheless, and demand for heavier bows quickly outstripped our ability to make them. Every maker of weapons of all kinds began to turn out the most powerful instruments they could devise, working all the hours they could manage. Over the following weeks, the attacks were ceaseless, to the point where it became increasingly difficult to feed ourselves effectively. A village meeting was called, and after some wrangling, Attila made his way to the centre of the amphitheatre. "Friends," he said, "if the attacks continue, we will be decimated. We are defenceless against these creatures. I believe the time has come to make contact with the governor." A number of people immediately walked off in disgust, and some shouted insults, but he stood his ground, and so frightened were the people of our village that many were prepared to listen to him, even though his suggestion seemed entirely in violation of our principles that many had previously died to uphold. Contact with the governor meant contact with the governor's technology, and that we firmly abjured. "Salvation cannot lie with the others," shouted a voice. I couldn't see who. "We did not create this problem," shouted Attila. "It is not we who should have to solve it. The problem came from the others. The governor should solve it." At this, there was a murmur of general agreement. Then Karina pushed her way to the front. "I can contact the governor," she said. "Carrie," her mother shouted in disgust. "Let her speak," shouted another. "Jules and I have made contact with one of the others," she continued. "A boy named Peter. He could get a message to the governor." The entire amphitheatre fell into uproar, and a few more walked off. We discussed the matter for almost an hour, some firmly in favour of contacting the governor, some firmly against it, and some in favour of punishing Karina and me. "They have brought this upon us by contacting the others," said Alec at one point. I've never liked Alec. Fortunately, his suggestion was immediately ridiculed. Not even the most ardent organisation man or woman was willing to go along with that, or if any were, they had already left. In the end, it was decided that Karina and I should try to get a message to the governor. A message was duly written down with great solemnity by our scribe. It was rolled up and placed in a hollow tube of elderwood, and the ends were sealed with beeswax. By the time the full moon arrived, 10 were dead in our village, and at least a dozen in neighbouring villages. Every day there seemed to be more of the beasts. At night we could hear them roaring and growling. Phineas, our blacksmith, managed to fend one of them off by running it through with a sabre, and that was the only time any of us heard that one of the beasts had been successfully killed. When the day of the full moon came, Karina and I made our way to the edge of the forest, but Peter didn't appear. Our sufferings over the next month were impossible to describe to anyone who wasn't there. The beasts multiplied in number, until almost our only occupation was trying to kill them. We grew more successful at killing them, especially after Joe discovered a trick for poisoning arrows that proved quite effective, yet the supply of the monsters seemed only to increase. By the time of the next full moon, we were starving, and a third of our village had been killed by the beasts, including Karina's parents. She was not allowed time to mourn. Death and despair surrounded us. We knew our best chance was to try to contact Peter again. We could only hope no misfortune had befallen him. The situation of Karina and I had become more precarious, and not only due to the beasts. As the situation of our village and the whole of the organisation grew ever more dire, more and more gave credence to Alec's assertion that Karina and I were to blame for it, and perhaps even Joe too, as if failure to adhere to the organisation's strict no-contact rules had precipitated divine retribution. It was only then that I began to truly realise how bizarre our people really were. Superstition had always governed their lives to an absurd degree. Had it not been for Joe, who spoke powerfully in our favour, and Attila, I fully believe the most paranoid and aggressive voices among us would have carried the day, and Karina and I would have been offered as a sacrifice to the Fanged cats. On the day of the full moon, Joe and Attila insisted on accompanying Karina and myself, since at that point we stood little chance of making the journey to the edge of the forest without them. We began when the sun was still a quarter above the horizon, which was earlier than usual, but we would have to proceed far more carefully than we ever had done before, carefully watching for the cats. We had walked no more than an hour by the time they attacked, a group of 4 of them, seemingly working together. One of them leapt on Attila, and by some sort of a miracle he was able to get a sabre into it, and the thing fell lifeless to the ground, blood spurting from a wound on its neck. "They're not as tough as they look," he said, with evident satisfaction. The other 3 prowled around us warily at a distance. They clearly weren't giving up. Joe and I fired poison-tipped arrows at them, and after half an hour we'd managed to fell 2 of them. Only 1 remained. We crouched in the undergrowth trying to spot the remaining cat. "I saw it just a moment ago," said Attila. "Don't make a sound, it'll reappear." We waited, scarcely daring to breathe, until everything suddenly turned to blood and screaming. Somehow the animal had crept up behind us, and it had seized Attila by the top of his head. Karina was closest to him, and she slashed at it with her sabre. We saw the top of Attila's skull completely detach itself, exposing his brain. The wounded animal made to run off, then appeared to faint. Attila screamed for a short while, and Karina attended to him while Joe finished off the beast, but it was too late for Attila. He stopped screaming, wheezed for a while, and then died in front of us. The sight of him was horrible. It was a mercy that he hadn't lived for long. "They're going to kill us all," said Joe. "We have to turn back." "No," said Karina. "Peter is our only hope." "She's right," I said. "If we turn back, we'll all die anyway." We could do no more than cover Attila's body with some leaves and moss. We proceeded on our way with heavy hearts and a great deal of fear. "Did you see what it did to his skull?" said Joe. "Let's not talk about it," said Karina. We could hear the monsters growling to each other around us as we walked. "They're preparing for another attack," said Joe. We fully expected them to spring on us at any moment, but no attack came. It struck me that they were probably busy eating Attila. Finally, we arrived at the spot where we had met Peter so many times before. We settled down to wait, each of us facing in different directions, in the hope of spotting the beasts before they spotted us. None of us wanted our skulls torn off. The time when Peter usually turned up came and went, and the sun began to set. "He's not coming," said Joe. "He has to," I said. Finally, when twilight was well advanced, we saw the lights of Peter's bike heading towards us. "Thank God," said Karina. We noticed there was something wrong with Peter as soon as he was close enough that we could see his face. Even in the diminishing light, we could see that he was not at all himself. "Listen to me," he said as he jumped off his bike. "I need your help. Something very bad is going on." We all spoke at once. We had to make him understand about the beasts before he fell victim to them himself. "I've seen them," he said. "People have been attacked in the town. That's why I've got this." He pulled out a plasma gun stuck in a holster in front of his left hip. None of us had ever seen one before. "What is it?" I said. He fired it into the grass by way of explanation. A blue ring of light or electricity shot into the grass and sizzled for a moment before fizzling out, leaving a patch of grass burnt black with smoke rising from it. "I've no idea how it worked." "Impressive," said Joe. "The creatures aren't the worst of it," said Peter. "There have been mass arrests. Quentin was arrested, and Chiara. The governor has lost his mind. He's turned evil. It's the only explanation. Anyone who demands to know what's going on just disappears. They'll come for me next, I know it. I need you to hide me." "You don't understand," I said. "These beasts are eating us alive. Soon there'll be none of us left." Peter ran a shaky hand through his hair and looked around nervously. "Take me there now," he said. "I can get you weapons, but I need somewhere to hide tonight. First I need to get rid of this." He patted his bike. "There's an outside chance they're tracking it." He began to wind tape over the accelerator pedal. When he'd finished, he pressed a button and the bike shot off, skimming over the grass. We watched the orange light of its single iron jet recede into the distance. "You're going to have a damned hard time convincing those dimwits to use your fancy weapons," said Joe. I was a little shocked. I'd never heard Joe talk like that before. "They'll use them if they want to stay alive," said Peter. "Let's go." "Not yet," said Karina. "The cats are very active at twilight. We need to wait an hour till it's properly dark." "In the dark we won't see the bloody things coming," said Joe. "I will," said Peter, and he produced a pair of what looked like sunglasses from a pocket. "What are they?" I said. "Night vision specs," he said. "Anything alive will show up bright green." For an hour we sat and talked, Peter continually scanning the descending gloom. He told us there were many odd rumours about the governor. Some said the real source of his power was a gigantic fungus brain with the intelligence of 1 billion people combined in a single intellect. The governor had supposedly grown close to it and treated it like his closest friend, and perhaps his only friend. It was rumoured that the brain was infected with something and was decomposing. Others said that the brain had killed the governor and was now determined to wipe the planet clean of humanity. When we set off, we walked with renewed confidence. We had a weapon, we could see the creatures coming, and Peter would help us acquire enough weapons to defend the village. We fell to discussing whether the other villages would accept modern weapons, and none of us could believe they wouldn't under the circumstances. There might be a few holdouts, but as long as most people had guns or rifles, we'd be able to exterminate the beasts. We didn't see a single one of the creatures on the walk back to the village, but as we neared the village, we began to sense there was something wrong. There was no sign of the sentries that had been posted to watch for the animals, and we saw no candles or fires. We were almost home when Peter spotted something through his fancy spectacles. "Wait," he said. "What's this?" He shone a light on the ground, and immediately I was swept with a sickening fear. On the ground was a human hand. Karina gasped and grabbed at my arm. "Where's the rest of the body?" said Joe. Peter switched his flashlight to a higher setting and swung it around. Our eyes were met with a scene from hell itself. The ground was littered with body parts. We found the skulls of our friends, relatives and neighbours, with characteristic holes in them from the fangs of the beasts. Often the tops of the skulls had been parted from the rest. Everywhere we saw limbs, heads, limbless torsos. We ran to the centre of the village with hardly any thought for our own safety, and everywhere we saw the same thing. The huts were all empty, and not a single survivor remained, or not as far as we could determine. "What the hell happened here?" said Joe, his face pale and his voice shaking with grief and horror. "There must have been dozens of them," said Karina, "maybe hundreds." "Why is there no one in any of the huts?" said Peter. "They would have tried to help the others," said Joe. "Then they were torn to pieces." "And the children?" said Peter. We searched the huts, thinking perhaps there were children or elderly people who had barricaded themselves inside. We found only more sickeningly monstrous scenes of destruction. The animals had smashed their way into the huts with astonishing strength and prowess, perhaps even preternatural cunning. The sick, elderly people, pregnant women, they had all been massacred, and the animals had torn them apart with an apparent frenzied delight. We were a tough people. The organisation valued strength, discipline and self-containment. but I saw Karina break down in tears and Joe fall to vomiting and cursing. I myself felt only a numb shock, and I tried to console Karina as best I could, but she was beyond consoling. I found it impossible to truly comprehend what I was seeing. It didn't seem real, but it was real. That night will haunt my dreams forever. When we were able to gather ourselves together to the point of coherence, we decided to check the neighbouring villages. Everywhere we found the same horrific scenes, beyond words or description. Our communities had become hellscapes of severed body parts. Here and there we found dead beasts too, killed with poison arrows or sabres or spears, but far too few to account for the sheer scale of the carnage. "What are we going to do?" I said. "I have an idea," said Peter, his voice shaking. "It'll sound crazy, but it's the only option left." He fumbled in his pocket and drew out a piece of folded paper. "Paper," he said, forcing a smile. "Turns out there's still a use for it." He unfolded it and lay it on the ground, smoothing it out and shining the flashlight on it. "What is it?" I said. "It's a map," he said. "A map to a portal." "What kind of portal?" I asked. "Earth," he said. "It's a portal to Earth." "That can't be," said Karina. "The one thing the governor has always told us is that we must never try to visit the Earth. If there was a portal, he would have closed it down." "He doesn't know about it," said Joe quietly. "Joe?" I said, amazed that Joe would know anything about such a thing. "I've heard rumours," said Joe, "but not for a long time. When I was a boy. The portal isn't the governor's doing. Someone on Earth figured out how to do it. It's maintained from Earth." "But we can never survive on Earth," said Karina. "We don't know anything about the Earth. What language do they even speak?" "Italian," said Peter. "They speak Italian. All our ancestors came from there. Of course we can survive there." "I've heard that on Earth, diamonds are incredibly valuable," said Joe. "If we give them diamonds, they will give us food and shelter in return." He patted a small bag that was clipped to his belt. "I probably have enough here that we would all be rich on the Earth." We looked at each other, unable to process our thoughts properly. Then we heard a strange growling in the distance, followed by an eerie screech. "They're going to come back," said Karina. "Maybe soon." "How far is it?" I asked Peter. "It's close," he said. 50 miles, no more. In the Forbidden Zone. We set off immediately. We had no choice. Not until noon the next day did we rest. By evening, we were at the border of the Forbidden Zone, a lifeless expanse of desert in which no machine ever worked. At least, no machine designed by the governor. By then we were too exhausted to go further. We had no choice but to rest. We built a rough shelter and made it as secure as we could, placing spikes facing outwards. Even though we were all extremely tired, we agreed that one person would remain awake at all times, scanning the darkness for signs of the beasts. Peter's soft life was his undoing, and very nearly the undoing of all of us. Joe and Karina and I were used to heavy physical exercise. We were used to running, to walking, to hiking through the forests, even to distant villages. Not so for Peter. His had been a life of ease and luxury. We let him sleep first because out of the four of us, he was by far the most exhausted. I woke him up just as the sky was beginning to show the first signs of dawn, and he was still awfully tired, but he was determined to take his turn on watch. I don't know whether he fell asleep or simply failed to properly pay attention, but the next thing we knew it was dawn, and one of the creatures had Peter's head in its jaws. Joe ran at it and grabbed Peter's gun and fired it at the beast. It fell back, but part of Peter's skull went with it. In a few seconds, it was dead, and so was Peter. It wasn't his fault. He saved us. We will keep his memory alive always. It turned out the one good thing the organisation had done for us is it had made us tough. We gathered whatever seemed like it might be useful from Peter's possessions, covered him with tree branches and rocks, and began to make our way into the Forbidden Zone. For 6 hours we walked through the arid, dusty landscape, using up most of our water in the heat, until finally we arrived at an oasis, a hill surrounded by scrubby vegetation. Water emerged from a spring a little way up the hill, and a handful of pine trees clung to life downstream. "This is it," said Joe. "Somewhere here there must be a cave. The entrance may be hidden." We searched for 2 hours and finally we found it, a small opening in the hillside underneath the scrub. One by one we squeezed through the hole, emerging into a low cave. We followed it for perhaps 200 meters, in places climbing over boulders that sometimes almost reached to the ceiling, leaving only narrow gaps through which to pass. The portal consisted of a mass of intertwined wires and odd metal spheres, which formed a rough circle. In the middle, the cave wall seemed transparent and indistinct, and we could see more cave, of a different type of stone, through it. "Good luck," said Joe, extending his hand. "What do you mean?" I said, suddenly gripped with a new fear. "You're coming with us?" "No," said Joe. "I'm staying here. Someone needs to stay and fight. Besides, you're young. I'm not. I don't want to start again on a new planet. My home is here." "There's nothing left of your home, Joe," said Karina. "Come with us." But we could not change his mind. His plan was to raise a kind of army against the governor, drawing recruits from the others, and from any of the organisation that might still be left alive. "Then take Peter's doctor," I said, proffering the small electronic tablet I'd found among Peter's possessions. "You take it," said Joe. "You two will grow old without it. Besides, who knows what diseases they have on the Earth." "If you're going to fight, you'll need it," said Karina. "Didn't do Peter much good, did it?" said Joe. "Besides, I've already got one, had it for years." He pulled a doctor from his backpack, switching it on to show us it still worked. It quickly analysed his health status, giving him a clean bill. "You sly old dog," I said, laughing in spite of everything. "Thinking of de-aging myself to about 30 years, said Joe. "I was a lot stronger when I was 30. No one's going to judge me for it now, are they? Here, take my diamonds. Maybe you can trade them. When you've established yourselves, leave a note telling me how I can find you on the Earth side of the portal. I might try to look for you one day." Karina and I hugged him, and he made his way back down the tunnel. We stepped through the portal and continued making our way through the tunnel, which had now ceased to consist of sandstone and more resembled jagged limestone. Eventually we emerged on a hillside, blinking in the strong light, and far below us we beheld a city. "That is our new home," I said. "I wonder what it's called," said Karina. "Let's find out," I said, and we began to make our way towards it. Soon we encountered roads, with strange wheeled vehicles trundling noisily along them. After a while we passed a couple engaged in an argument. They broke off their debate to stare at us in astonishment. "Did you hear them?" said Karina, when they were out of earshot. "They were speaking Italian, some sort of archaic form of it, but I could understand them." "I think they considered our appearance outlandish," I said. "We'll have to do something about it as soon as we can." When we reached the town, we began to look for somewhere we might try to trade our diamonds. It was clear we were attracting many curious looks, but no one tried to accost us. Soon we found a shop that had diamond jewellery in the window. We had never seen a shop before in our lives, but the purpose of it was clear enough. We went in. Inside we found a man reading a newspaper. He dropped it on the counter and gawked at us in naked astonishment. "Would you be interested in purchasing a diamond?" I said. "What have you got?" he said. I showed him one of the smaller diamonds, and he examined it with a small instrument, sniffing strangely. 12 million lira, he said finally, But you'll have to come back tomorrow. I don't have that kind of money here now. We need money now, said Karina. Where are you from? He said. Some words caught my eye in a headline in the newspaper, and I took a chance. Yugoslavia, I said. We're Yugoslavians. We've just come from there. Karina nodded in agreement. Why are you dressed like that? Said the man. This is our traditional dress, I said. What are you, Croats? Said the man. Exactly, I said. He shook his head in disbelief. I can give you $500,000 now and the rest tomorrow, he said. You'll have to leave the diamond as security. I'll give you a receipt. That's fine, said Karina. As we were leaving, he shouted after us. You know, you could consider taking a bath. Do you think we've got enough to last us till tomorrow? Said Karina, after we closed the shop door. I've no idea, I said. Let's try to find somewhere we can spend the night. We asked one of the many people who stopped to stare at us where we might find a room, and she pointed us to a hotel. There we inquired as to the price of a night's stay. 25,000, said the proprietor. Karina squeezed my hand. It seemed the diamonds were indeed valuable. After some formalities, the proprietor asked for our passports. We don't have any, I said. We're Croats. You can't stay here without passports, he said. We'll pay double, I said. I'm sorry, he said. It's the law. No passports, no room. But I detected hesitation. This man, I could tell, was not truly a stickler for rules. Triple, I said. He sighed. Room 153, he said, placing a metallic object in front of us, which of course we soon understood to be a key, although we had to enlist the help of a fellow guest to explain what to do with it, and I don't doubt that he thought us quite insane. In a hotel room we were able to wash, and later that day we arranged for food to be brought to us. The following morning we set out from the hotel with renewed optimism. As we passed through the town, we saw a man slumped against a wall, holding a sign that said, "I'm hungry, please help." Poor man, said Karina. We should give him some of our money. Let's at least get the rest from the diamond seller first, I said. Near the man we saw people sitting eating at a table. We sat down at an empty table and sure enough, someone appeared and asked us what we would like, although again we drew the usual curious looks. We'd like the same as them, I said, pointing at the people who were eating. We had no idea what the food on earth was like, but we were soon brought cappuccino, as I now know it, and sweet pastries, which in English might be known as apple turnovers. It's not bad, said Karina. A family sat down at the table next to us, then soon moved away again, sniffing and giving us odd looks. There were dark circles under Karina's eyes, and her face was bruised from fighting the beast that killed Attila. I looked no better myself. But I was fairly sure it wasn't our faces that were drawing attention. Our clothes were giving us away, both by their appearance and their smell. We need to change these clothes, dress more like them, said Karina, echoing my thoughts. It's not going to be easy, I said. It's not even just the clothes. We smell wrong. Have you noticed they all smell of oils or balms? We need an advisor, said Karina. Someone we can be honest with. Someone who can tell us how to blend in and where to buy clothes and passports. I don't know where we can find such a person, I said. Leave it to me, said Karina. I have a plan. After we had finished eating, Karina went to the man slumped against the wall, the one holding the sign. She squatted down and whispered to him. We need help, she said. We're not from this planet. We need a friend here on Earth to explain things to us. Do you think you're funny, said the man. Go and bother someone else. She produced a wad of lira, perhaps 100,000, and stuffed it into his hand. We'll pay you, she said. There's a lot more where this came from. The man's eyes widened as he counted the money. He struggled to his feet and straightened his tie. He didn't smell too good, but I suspected we smelt worse. He extended his hand in greeting. Welcome to planet Earth, my friends, he said. Thank you for listening. You've been listening to Science Horror and my name's John. All the stories on this channel are written by me. If you've been following my stories for a while, you might recognise that this takes place in the same universe as the Beast of Conconello. Of course, the story sounds ridiculous, but the idea is multiple people have discovered how to make artificial intelligence that can actually design improved versions of itself. So there's been a kind of runaway artificial intelligence, and that has enabled people to terraform and populate entire planets. Next week I have a story for you that's a bit more down to earth. It's about a person who gradually goes completely blind, but what he thought to be a weakness turns out to be a strength. Do join me again next Monday for that. If you enjoyed this story, please construct an interplanetary portal and bring hordes of people to the Earth who will click the like and subscribe buttons on my videos. Thank you so much. Have a good week, and until next time, sleep well.